The faithful congregate for an evening mass while the organ plays a light tune at St. Mary's Basilica in the heart of Krakow. The summer sun is still shining through the majestic stained glass windows, lighting the magnificent altarpiece depicting the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin Mary. The altar was carved in the years 1477-1489 by Veit Stoss, an artist who came from Nuremberg and is widely recognized as the leading sculptor of his day. The recent renovation of this magnificent piece of late Gothic art has turned heads among the conservation community, not least Europa Nostra, the largest network in Europe which promotes and advocates for the protection of cultural heritage across the old continent. My name's John Beecham, and welcome to this podcast.
Dzień dobry, witam Państwa bardzo serdecznie w imieniu Europa Nostra Krakow Heritage Hub. Jesteśmy regionalnym...
The European Heritage Award, Europa Nostra Award, which is presented by the European Commission along with Europa Nostra, is the highest such distinction for best practices in heritage, both natural and cultural. In 2023, 30 outstanding heritage achievements from 21 countries were awarded Europe's top honor in the field, with the Veit Stoss Altarpiece winning in the conservation category. Professor Jacek Purchla, Vice-President of Europa Nostra, highlights the importance of the award.
Europejska Nagroda Dziedzictwa, która jest od ponad 20 lat wspólną nagrodą Europa Nostra i Komisji Europejskiej, wyrosła...
The European Heritage Award, which has been a joint prize between Europa Nostra and the European Commission for more than 20 years, has grown before our eyes, especially in recent years, into a true European Oscar in the broad field of cultural heritage and its conservation. It is a prize that is awarded each year by a jury of eminent European experts in 5 very different disciplines. And the gala of this prize, which is held each year during the so-called European Heritage Summit, really allows us to multiply this good news and to present not only the winners, but their good practices, for which they are awarded throughout Europe. Europa Nostra is today a European movement. We often say the voice of civil society, which brings together organizations concerned with the preservation of monuments, the protection of cultural heritage, and its promotion in more than 40 countries between Portugal and the Caucasus. So what is also important and what gives satisfaction to the laureates is the very strong competition. It is very difficult to stand out and break through, which is something that we often do not realize in Poland. Looking at St. Mary's altar, one can immediately exclaim, "We simply deserve it."
Przebić, z czego sobie w Polsce często nie zdajemy sprawy. Patrząc na ołtarz mariacki, można od razu zakrzyknąć: nam się po prostu należy. Ja myślę, że to, co jest ważne, to, że ołtarz Weita Stossa, ikona europejskiej sztuki europejskiej rzeźby późnośredniowiecznej.
I think that what is important is that the Veit Stoss Altarpiece, an icon of European art, of European sculpture of the late Middle Ages, has been recognized. The altarpiece has been recognized not only as this extraordinary, outstanding work of art, but above all for two extremely important reasons. On the one hand, it is a patronage aware of its value, but also of its duty towards the heritage of the patron, which is the St. Mary's Parish that hosts the Basilica. But on the other hand, the synergy between the patron and the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow and the very outstanding conservators who represent the highest European level, only that often Europe does not know about it. And this award creates an opportunity. It is not an opportunity measurable in money. The value of this award is, above all, to show Europe and the world how great Poland's conservation potential is today, and how modern our experts are today in saving masterpieces of this kind. Masterpieces of our common European heritage, which is undoubtedly the altarpiece.
W ratowaniu tego rodzaju arcydzieł naszego wspólnego europejskiego dziedzictwa, jakim niewątpliwie jest ołtarz przybysza z Norymbergi.
Archpresbyter Dr. Dariusz Raś is in charge of St. Mary's Parish and the Basilica in Krakow. He underlines the cultural but also spiritual significance of the Veit Stoss Altarpiece.
No, trzeba tutaj pomyśleć o tej atmosferze sakrum. To jest jakby najważniejszy element, tak? Misterium, pewna cisza, pewna zaduma nad tajemnicą opowieści Weita Stossa
You have to think about the sacred atmosphere here. This is, as it were, the most important element, the mystery. A certain silence, a certain reverie over the mystery of the story of Veit Stoss and the legend, the golden legend of the life of Mary and Jesus, because that is what the altar is dedicated to. This is the first phase of thinking about the altar. In addition to this, it is important to know that there is a great piece of history behind the altar. It is 500 years old. It is a huge legacy and an important part also of the heritage of the city, which commissioned the sculpture, which commissioned the project, which paid for the project in the past, and which today we are obliged to honor, also materially. Hence the institutions and the parish which work together to support this important element of culture, heritage, art. Today, it is only fair to say that when we stand before such an altar, we feel a sense of pride in having such a great work of art that speaks of the past, but also speaks of us.
Mówiące o przeszłości, ale też mówiące o nas.
Robert Piaskowski, plenipotentiary for culture of the mayor of the city of Krakow, explains how the award is a boon for the city's cultural heritage, as well as shines a light on best practices in the field of heritage conservation.
No przede wszystkim to jest wielka radość dla Krakowa, bo przecież ołtarz Weita Stossa powstał u schyłku późnego gotyku, u progu renesansu. Przede wszystkim
Above all, it is a great joy for Krakow because after all, the Veit Stoss Altarpiece was created at the end of the late Gothic period, at the dawn of the Renaissance, primarily from contributions made by Krakowians. And the story is often quoted that its cost of commissioning from Veit Stoss amounted to the city's annual budget at the time, if not more. This shows how much importance the city councillors and residents of the city already attached at the time to this most precious object of art associated with our city, and whose subsequent recovery after World War II, arrival in Krakow and subsequent restorations always build up certain emotions. They emphasized and brought up the identity of our city associated with the priceless work of sacred art. But they also gave certain psychological value, which we have witnessed, for example, after the completion of the process of restoration, conservation of the altarpiece in these last years, when the opening of the altarpiece was associated with the period of recovery from the pandemic. The emotions of all these gathered in St. Mary's Basilica during the presentation of the completion of the restoration work were of such a nature as to reaffirm the civitas, the community, the urban community around the priceless object of heritage.
Te emocje wszystkich osób zebranych w Bazylice Mariackiej podczas
And this is perhaps the most important thing about this award, that it confirms what is behind the establishment of the Europa Nostra Award in general, that it is above all to emphasize the excellence, this high quality of promoting the value of cultural and natural heritage for the community of Europe, for the common identity, for strengthening and deepening constantly our knowledge, our approach to the multidimensional cultural heritage of such a complex city as Kraków.
Promowania wartości też dziedzictwa kulturowego i przyrodniczego dla społeczności Europy.
On the other hand, it is also a huge promotion for Kraków in the international arena. After all, it is 40 countries which are gathered in Europa Nostra. It is more than 200 projects submitted for these awards, and only one project from Poland. And that in a not insignificant category, because it is for conservation, for restoration work, which for many is an example of a very modern approach using all available modern technologies and carried out in a consortium of the Academy of Fine Arts with other entities, but also, above all, co-financed, irrespective of the political and philosophical opinions, both by the city government, the Social Committee for Renovation of Kraków Monuments, the Ministry of Culture, and the St. Mary's Parish, which is the guardian of this object. So this is also an important example of such social involvement on many different levels, such a mix of funding, and above all, great research work by a consortium of scientists. There are also many different perspectives in this thread, through which the significance of this conservation for local identity, for development of science, for the development of knowledge about the art of the period can be seen. And here in this altar accumulate so many narratives that we can publicly express internationally on the occasion of this award. It is priceless.
Konserwacji dla tożsamości lokalnej, dla rozwoju nauki, rozwoju wiedzy o sztuce tego okresu. No i tutaj w tym ołtarzu kumuluje się tak wiele narracji, które przy okazji tej nagrody możemy publicznie, międzynarodowo wypowiedzieć. Jest to bezcenne.
The meticulous conservation of the Veit Stoss Altarpiece, based on in-depth research, was carried out in situ for over 1,000 days and involved a team of the best specialists from all over Europe. They were led by Professor Jarosław Adamowicz from the Krakow Academy of Fine Arts. He explains how the team had to prepare for such a huge undertaking.
Musieliśmy być świadomi od samego początku tego, że ołtarz jest miejscem wyjątkowym. I wbrew
We had to be aware from the very beginning that the altarpiece is a special place, and contrary to what we teach at the Academy, which is that we should care about our heritage almost equally, no matter how, what historical, artistic or material value we are dealing with, but professional ethics should apply to all works. But of course, there is an exceptional thing. This work of the highest class, more than 530 years old at the moment, and as we have probably all emphasized many times, we are simply lucky, we as Poles, we as Krakowians, we as Europeans, for the reason that in bearing this heritage, it should be clearly stated, works of art which have been standing for more than 500 years in the objects for which they were created, that is, medieval altars, are extremely rare in the whole of Europe. And we still have the Veit Stoss Altarpiece in the place for which it was intended. If it wasn't for the vile period of the Second World War, I would say that without much problem had survived in this place. On the other hand, we had this episode during which the altar was dismantled and transported beyond the borders. Not only beyond the borders of the city, but also beyond the borders of the country. It was fortunate that everything came back to us and we have this work of art here in
Wszystko
Kraków.
do nas wróciło, no i mamy to dzieło tutaj w Krakowie. Myśmy to troszeczkę tak zorganizowali, to było takie specjalne miejsce.
It was such a special place. If we were to go back to how to describe what was happening here, I would say we organized a working platform at the back of the altar. All the work took place strictly in the basilica, but we were not visible. We worked at the back. When our work started, we made a very good contemporary 3D inventory with photo plans, photo autoplans, and with vector documentation, thanks to which we were able to print large format photographs on a scale of 1:1.
Fotografie w skali 1:1.
We mounted excellent quality photographs in the places where pieces were dismantled. I'm convinced that many people who visited the Basilica at certain times during these 5 years did not even know that some elements were photographs and some elements were reliefs that were truly original.
I podobnie zresztą z tymi działaniami badawczymi.
And so we worked. And likewise with these research activities, except of course for those which required the transport of selected elements to special laboratories or scientific units with which we collaborated with. And here I would mention right away, if I may, that it was a gigantic team.
Konserwacji i restauracji dzieł sztuki, taką jednostkę, która...
Not only was the whole project carried out by the Inter-University Institute for the Conservation of Works of Art, a unit which at the time brought together specialists in many fields from the Academy of Fine Arts in Krakow and the Academy of Fine Arts in Warsaw, the largest and the oldest two conservation departments in Poland. But we also cooperated with Jagiellonian University, the Foundry Institute, the Institute of Nuclear Physics, AGH University of Krakow, the Military Academy of Technology from Warsaw. There were a lot of these units. Apart from that, we also had the so-called Team of Permanent Experts, which was an international team, and here a number of names of both art history and conservation specialists from Munich, from Stuttgart, from Frankfurt, from the Ufficio delle Pietre Dure in Florence, from the Royal Institute of Brussels. And this was a body that met with us at least once or twice a year, and we discussed what we were doing, what we were learning. And in addition, this cooperation resulted in us also being able to research works of art. For example, in southern Germany, which we also had the opportunity to see very personally and up close.
Czyli wielopłaszczyznowa współpraca, wielopłaszczyznowe działanie.
Multifaceted cooperation, multifaceted action.
The altarpiece originally stood at 18 meters high and 11 meters wide, and its figures are based on residents of medieval Krakow, who sat as models for the artist. As such, it is an interesting source of knowledge on the culture, customs and history of the city at the time. It is not the first such altarpiece to be placed in the basilica either. Archpresbyter Dr. Dariusz Raś gives us a glimpse into the altar's past.
Był inny ołtarz, dużo mniejszy, który...
There was another altar, much smaller, which was inadequate for the ambitions of the royal city of Krakow. The burghers of the city, which they considered too low-flying.
Element historii, że...
There was also an element of history that during the construction of the presbytery, a chancel was built which unfortunately collapsed. It destroyed the previous altar and the chancel was rebuilt. A master from Prague built anew the presbytery we have today. And the city councillors came up with the idea that the ambition of the city like Krakow should be to make it the largest.
Takiego miasta jak Kraków powinno być coś...
The 30-year-old Veit Stoss was already known in Europe at the time. He was brought to Krakow and became a resident and a taxpayer of the city. Thanks to this, many monuments came to Poland from this Nuremberg family, and this is probably the greatest work he ever did. He worked in his workshop on Grodzka Street for several years and caused people from all over the world, from Europe and from Poland, to come to Krakow today as a UNESCO city, to visit the old town. And the Krakowians visited too.
Krakowa, ludzie z całego świata, z Europy, z Polski, a i krakowianie zaglądają tu chętnie.
It's worth noting that the altarpiece has undergone a number of restorations throughout the centuries. But in 2015, in order to keep the altarpiece in place in the basilica, a workshop was established behind the altar where conservators would go about their work. The team worked on over 200 figures, with the largest weighing in at 250 kilograms and exceeding 3 meters in height, as well as thousands of individual sculpted elements. Professor Adamowicz explains how modern techniques were implemented for the altarpiece.
Ta współczesna konserwacja dzieł sztuki właściwie to jest takie wielopłaszczyznowe działanie. Właśnie od bardzo szerokiego planowania.
This contemporary conservation of works of art is actually a multifaceted activity. It ranges from very extensive planning to gigantic research process, because our duty is not only to care for and preserve the substance of a work of art, but first and foremost to expand our knowledge of the monument in every respect. This is what our program was called, the Research and Conservation Program. And that first word, research, in some areas indeed, I don't want to say it dominated, but it was indeed gigantically expanded.
Udało nam się zastosować szereg nowatorskich i nowych.
And I would say that we managed to apply a number of innovative and new or contemporary methods that are very rarely used to gain knowledge about monuments. This is a whole range of physical and chemical research, including the use of technical computer tomography or laser ablation, X-ray spectroscopy, where we read the work in the elemental dimension, I would say, and in the context of the whole composition, not just in the context of a single point. Consequently, there really was a lot of that in terms of these new things that were applied.
Pełnych układów kompozycyjnych. W związku z tym tego naprawdę było bardzo, bardzo dużo.
This contemporary conservation is a little, or even a lot different than in the past. It is not the same approach as our predecessors had, with all due respect to their activities. But today we are interested in everything, the smallest hole, the smallest splinter. From all of these, we are able to decipher a huge amount of information relating to the original technology, and therefore we are able to answer how much of the original artwork is in the altarpiece. And this is probably the overriding thing, because it is this that should interest us most.
A w związku z tym jesteśmy w stanie odpowiedzieć, ile tego dzieła sztuki oryginalnego jest w tym rzesz ołtarzu. I to jest chyba rzecz nadrzędna, bo to powinno nas najbardziej interesować.
The altarpiece is a collection of biblical scenes from the life of Mary and Jesus, including the Nativity and resurrection of Christ. With such a diverse set of biblical imagery, it is not difficult to imagine that everyone has their own favorite or preferred scene. However, it is not just the biblical scenes which are of importance here, but the intrinsic historical value of the sculptures. Jacek Purchla from Europa Nostra.
No, to jest niezwykle trudne, żeby nie powiedzieć podchwytliwe pytanie, bo oczywiście wypada zakrzyknąć, że ta scena centralna
This is an extremely difficult, not to say tricky question, because it is of course fair to exclaim that this central scene depicting the falling asleep of the Virgin Mary in the company and presence of the apostles, clearly on the artistic ground, is a masterpiece. It is an extraordinary masterpiece of late medieval art. The expression of this scene remains in the memory of everyone who sees it even once. But what intrigues me, also as a researcher of the history of Krakow, are the scenes from the wings of the altar showing Krakow of the late 15th century, or maybe not Krakow, but the Krakowians. This is extremely intriguing for the iconography of Krakow of the late Middle Ages and for our knowledge of Krakow, which was then at the peak of its development, the peak of its importance, also on the map of Europe at the time. And I think this is the multidimensional significance and multidimensional value of this altarpiece.
Wartość tego ołtarza, a ja osobiście wychowywałem się na historii.
And I personally grew up on the story of the Yellow Shoe, on the book and on the film, which just in the early 1960s, so a long time ago, was this image that inspired me, a young child at the time, to take an interest in the history of my city.
Obrazem do zainteresowania się przeszłością mojego miasta.
Robert Piaskowski.
Każdy z nas ma swoje ulubione fragmenty tego ołtarza.
Everyone has their favorite parts of this altar. I have quite a few photographs of the kind I took privately during the successive stages of the works on the altarpiece. Among others, such fantastically preserved and actually never conserved, because there are such perfectly preserved elements of the background with white floral elements on the wings. On the backgrounds on which these central sculptures are placed, these tiny plants, herbs, these botanical structures painted with great care, made a great impression on me from close-up. Just like the one preserved in the upper quarters, in probably the resurrection scene, there is a tiny gap which was preserved by previous conservation teams. And Professor Adamowicz's team also decided to preserve this gap, which is an imperfection, a mistake, or a defect connected with the use of the altar over the centuries. But the preservation of this defect, with such a magical, for me, clearance of the light at certain movements of the sun, is something extremely mystical. And exactly in this scene, it has an additional symbolic, even religious dimension. The moment of the opening of the altarpiece after the period of conservation, when, in silence, that creak from the door of the redos, opened by the nuns associated with the Basilica, and the preservation of that sound of unlubricated joints, is also part of such a ritual and sonosphere associated with the altarpiece. We rarely think of it in terms of this spectacle, this theatricality. On the other hand, this theatricality, this story, this Biblia Pauperum, also has its rituals related to the opening, to the sound, to the illumination of the altar. And I perceive it paradoxically as a living work, a very dynamic work, a work, one could say a film, which lives in contact, in interpretation, in play with light, sound, music, liturgy. And I have my favorite characters from the altar. They are, paradoxically, the characters of the reading apostles. I always say that, since we are a UNESCO City of Literature, it is enough to see the altar of Veit Stoss. And once I tried to count how many books there are, and I counted 38. But I don't know if this is the right number. Indeed, the apostles, the saints all read, so the fact that Krakow is a city of literature was already proven in the time of Veit Stoss. I very much like to cite this example.
Lubię przywoływać ten przykład.
Jarosław Adamowicz.
Chyba takiego jednego elementu to nie mam, bo...
I don't think I have such a single element, because you have to realize that the altarpiece is made up of thousands of small elements, sculptures, bas-reliefs, micro-architecture. There's an enormous amount of these details. Probably the greatest joy for me, for the team as a whole, is that we have managed, first of all, to reach hitherto unknown information about both the coloring and the state of preservation. I would say it is with great pride that I look at how we were able to refer to the oldest photographs, that is, how it was possible, despite everything, to go back to the layout of the details and the layout of the sculptures, the reliefs in centimeter differences, taking into account the oldest photographs that we have preserved from 1860-1861, that is, from the time before the greatest conservation, which took place in the second half of the 19th century. Major changes were made then. Therefore, by reaching for archival material, we were able to reconstruct a number of arrangements and connections by looking only at the details, focusing on the differences between the years, analyzing what transformations that altarpiece was subjected to. But these are such minimal details that they are practically unattainable for the average viewer.
Tak minimalne detale, że dla przeciętnego...
In reality, it really requires a lot of focus and comparison. Again, without modern equipment, without constant work with tablets on the scaffolding, we would not have been able to do this either.
Stałej pracy z tabletami na rusztowaniu też byśmy nie dali rady.
No matter which way you look at the Veit Stoss Altarpiece, there's no doubting that it moves us spiritually. Archpresbyter Dr. Dariusz Raś sums up.
To jest opowieść o człowieku, który żyje na ziemi, ma jakieś aspiracje.
This is the story of a man who lives on earth, has aspirations, dreams, but is de facto called for higher things. Some believers talk about thinking about heaven. When we look at our lives, we sometimes say that we are not destined, called only to live here on earth. We have this spiritual element that pulls us upwards all the time, and you can't live just with your nose to the ground. On the other hand, it is generally a story about a woman who is born. We have such apocryphal scenes here, the birth of the little Mary. St. Anne is present at the delivery. This is one of the very beautiful apocryphal scenes. You can't see her now. She is visible when the altar is closed. She is perfectly visible in the morning, but this is her whole life cycle.
Ona jest dumna ze swojego syna.
She is proud of her son. This too needs to be said. Her son turns out to be a change of era in the life of mankind. We count time from him, from his birth, and she is de facto aware of it all. Very humble to the end. And why to the end? Because look at the very top in the crowning scene.
Tak wyżej byśmy wlecieli, zwłaszcza.
We will see that she is surprised that they are giving her a crown in heaven. This humility is difficult perhaps for modern man. Perhaps it has always been quite difficult to attain. But you can see that this woman is constantly surprised by God with his goodness, but also in humility accepts honors and gifts.
Dobrocią, ale też w pokorze przyjmuje jakieś wyróżnienia i dary.
The restoration of the altarpiece highlights the need to act decisively when dealing with works which are centuries old. Thanks to the whole multitude of people involved in the conservation work, Veit Stoss's masterpiece lives on, but it is essential to build awareness of the heritage value of the altarpiece so that it will be kept in good condition for years to come. This was a free-range production for Europa Nostra Krakow Heritage Hub.